I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Emma Ruttkamp-Bloem, who is the head of the Department of Philosophy of the University of Pretoria. And Emma has been the chairperson of the UNESCO ad hoc expert group on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And this, under her leadership, this expert group has produced the UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of AI, which is a standard-setting instrument that has been signed by the government of 193 countries. And Emma will provide us with an introductory overview of this recommendation and also briefly speak about some of the principles and values that the recommendation promotes, of which some will be explored further in session 2 in breakout groups. A very warm virtual applause, and thank you very much for joining, Emma. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Achim. I'm very glad to be here. Just going to share my screen quickly. Okay, I'm going to start because I am a little bit concerned about time. But I just want to say, I think this is a fantastic workshop, and I really congratulate you on it. So why is AI technology important on a global scale? At the moment, it is focused on abilities of algorithms to process information at ever-increasing speed and overtake human decision-making and prediction capability at all levels. This kind of technology is at least as important as the discovery of electricity in terms of transforming societies, businesses, and governments, because it has immense power for good on a spectrum of dimensions, from education to healthcare, law enforcement, risk management, financial and stock prediction, sustainable development, and many others. However, it also has immense power for harm, from disrespecting the right to privacy to manipulating agency and threatening mental integrity, to exclusion of certain groups at levels perhaps not seen before in our history. So this brings us to the global recommendation, of which I'm not going to say anything because Achim has already introduced it, but we are very proud of it and very grateful to member states for the wonderful negotiation process. So the most important feature of this document is that it is intended to be a recommendation for a global instrument, and that all regions and different AI actors were equally represented and had an equal voice during the discussion of drafting the document. And I can really attest to this, and it's something that we are very proud of. There's also two other novel aspects to it, is that it focuses on gender equality, or it highlights gender equality and protection of the environment and ecosystem. But of course, there are challenges to realizing the promise of a global instrument. Firstly, reality does not in all countries or wherever AI actors are gathered necessarily reflect the goals, values, and principles mentioned in the document. Secondly, the exclusion of low and middle income countries from most international discussion on AI, which impacts on the development of and trust in AI technology, as well as on the strength of adherence to regulation that did not help to formulate, is a challenge. Then thirdly, tension between the notion of shared values and the recognition of diversity and embracing of inclusivity and interconnectedness had to be addressed. So we tried not to exclude low and middle income countries, but they have been excluded in the past, and this made for problems. But then we do need global regulation because the harm that we are talking about is to humanity as a whole. And realizing sustainable and ethical AI development requires international cooperation so that we can stop ethics dumping, for instance. Widening of inequality will impact negatively on everyone. Africa has the lowest median age in the world. They have to be included in conversations that will impact on the future. A recognition of the mutual human bondedness among all humans that we find in philosophies such as Ubuntu, Mahayana Buddhism, and Taoism should underpin global AI ethics regulation. We agreed precisely to ensure diversity. Every human belongs to a greater whole, which thrives when all its constituent parts are enabled to thrive. Thus, every human should be allowed to thrive. But how does this happen? 3 brief points. there has to be epistemic justice. We have to hear each other. We have to recognize each other as credible knowers and recognize each other's interpretations of the world. So the meaning ascribed to value should be articulated and communicated in the context of openness to diverse engagement. There should be sensitivity to formulation. I cannot stress this enough. We need to reflect on formulation and use culture as a calculus of values, an interpretation tool to measure inclusivity and predict adherence. For instance, the right to privacy in an AI context remains core in all cultures. Everybody can equally be harmed if it's transgressed, but how it is engaged with and expressed in a rights-based individualist culture may differ from how it is expressed in a duty-based collectivist culture. And then there should be an active awareness of and support for fighting data colonialism. So if we now look at the recommendation itself, I'm going to say a lot about the values and principles in terms of the breakout groups. So I'm not going to read them now. We'll cover all of them as we carry on. Just a few words on the actionability. We had to make sure that the recommendation is concrete enough to make an impact, firm enough and open enough to ensure adherence, and supple enough to have validity in the future. And we try to do this by defining policy areas with policy actions that were supposed to concretize the principles and values. And in this context, I just want to stress, and I think this is important, that UNESCO recognizes that all member states would not be in the same status of readiness, and that we recognize that that status is dynamic and moves on a continuum of different dimensions, including scientific, infrastructural, societal, legal, and other dimensions. And at the moment, UNESCO is developing, and I have a meeting for that group just after this, is developing a readiness and an ethical impact assessment tool to assist member states in moving forward in terms of this readiness status. Now, what I want to do is to somehow get rid of my face so that I can see my screen. So in terms of the breakout groups, I want to focus on the last one first, which is respect, protection, and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms and human dignity. This is our first value, and this is also one of the breakout groups. This speaks to the inviolable and inherent dignity of every human and the intrinsic and equal worth of each individual human being. And it stresses that apart from respecting, protecting, and promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms right through the AI life cycles, we also stress that new technologies need to provide new means to advocate, defend, and exercise human rights and not to infringe them. Another value that could be interesting in the context of this group is ensuring diversity and inclusiveness, which is about promoting active participation. Inclusiveness means active participation in the terms of this recommendation. The value of living in peaceful, just, and interconnected societies would also be important. And this speaks to the fact that every human belongs to a greater whole, which thrives when all its constituent parts are enabled to thrive. And then basically all the other principles and the policy areas are really important for this breakout group. Then if you think about the group focused on preventing harm and making sure that there are no problematic societal impacts, the principle of proportionality and do no harm is important. And this principle makes sure that none of the processes related to the AI system lifecycle will exceed what is necessary to achieve legitimate aims or objectives and should be appropriate to the context. Safety and security as a principle comes into this conversation. Human, environmental, and ecosystem safety and security, and also accuracy and robustness. The right to privacy and data protection comes into this, a right that is essential to the protection of human dignity, human autonomy, and human agency, that is privacy. And also we stress that adequate data protection frameworks and governance mechanisms should be established in multi-stakeholder approaches. And then I would also say that data policy, culture and communication and information, and health and social well-being as policy areas could be interesting here. Another principle that should be added is awareness and literacy. And what is important here is that we need awareness and literacy in terms not only of digital skills, but also in terms of AI ethics training and media and information literacy and training, and that these should be joint movements or joint endeavors. So all members of society can take informed decisions about their use of AI systems and be protected from undue influence. I always say that civil society is our most powerful weapon. And then transparency and explainability as a principle. Okay, sorry, I did something now that I shouldn't have done. Okay, sorry. Transparency and explainability would also be a principle to take into consideration here. What is important is that these are very important, very serious demands that we make from the tech community in terms of the systems they develop, but that these demands should always be appropriate to the context and the impact, and that these kinds of making the systems transparent and explainable will lead to more peaceful, just, democratic, and inclusive societies. And then in terms of ensuring diversity and inclusiveness, that group that will focus on that issue, fairness and non-discrimination as a principle would be important, where we talk about promoting social justice and safeguarding fairness and non-discrimination of any kind, and promoting inclusive access for all, minimizing and avoiding reinforcing or perpetuating discriminatory or biased applications and outcomes. Gender should be important. I'm going to go a bit faster. Respect, protection, and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms and human dignity as a value, living in peaceful, just, and interconnected societies as a value, and economy and labor as a policy area would also speak to ensuring diversity and inclusiveness. Achieving accountability and human oversight, there we want to keep the focus on physical persons or to existing legal entities. Humans decide when to seize control and take decisions in life and death decisions. And then responsibility and accountability as a principle is important, which should be attributable to AI actors corresponding to their role in the life cycle, and in the policy areas of ethical impact and ethical governance and stewardship. Then in terms of realizing inclusive and multi-stakeholder governance, of course, that principle is important to respect national sovereignty, speak to different stakeholders, understand that this means that this will contribute to sustainable development, take into account shifts in technologies. And then the awareness and literacy principle is also here important in terms of inclusive stakeholders and in terms of the policy areas, development and international collaboration. In terms of the group speaking on sustainability, obviously the sustainability principle, which views sustainability as a set of constantly evolving goals across a range of dimensions. And then, of course, the policy area of environment and ecosystems and the value of environment and ecosystem flourishing. So that was very fast. So now I want to take you back to exclusion and difference in AI ethics. So I've said, mentioned data colonialism, and Karen Hayo in a new article that just came out described this as the result of the fact that global AI development is impoverishing communities and countries that don't have a say in its development. So the same communities and countries already impoverished by former colonial empires. What can we do against data colonialism? Restructure global AI and AI ethics debates, deconstructing the idea of a table to which people are invited. The table belongs to everybody. Inclusivity as equal participation. Be aware that the homogeneous nature of the tech community leads to single vision biases, limiting the values and interests built into the AI systems to those of certain groups and excluding others. And of algorithms picking up on the wrong patterns or being trained on data of overrepresented social groups, perpetuating structural bias, and I'll come back to that. Promoting the decolonization of AI, really important, decolonizing AI. Important work is done at the Leverhulme Institute for the Future of Intelligence, and it is noted in the literature that what is needed is for post-colonial and decolonial theories to work on understanding and shaping the ongoing advances in AI intelligence. And there is also the well-known Decolonial AI Manifesto that anybody can sign who supports this kinds of values, which is focused on creating alternative and techno-diverse communities. We cannot have conversations on AI ethics if we don't take note of this issue. Now, I want to give you an example. Now I'm speaking more broadly in terms of the nature of the workshop or the title of the workshop. I want to give you a concrete example of exclusion and manipulation. So if we think in terms of big data analytics, it has progress in this field has increased so significantly that I think people will be in a very deep panic very soon in terms of regulations. One of the most well-known examples of big data analytics is large language models, which are the expression of machine learning algorithms that work through large text-based data sets and that can recognize language and generate and predict text. So I want to highlight some of the risks relating to these LLMs to highlight global inequality, difference, and exclusion as a real problem. I'll just focus on two risks: misinformation. In the case where language models assign high probabilities to false, misleading, nonsensical, or poor quality information, there is the potential for various forms of deception. This even happens in the case where there isn't, in the case of lesser known languages. So potential harm, but it happens across the board. Okay. Potential harms here include allocation and material harm, or unethical actions by humans who take the LM prediction to be factually correct while it is not, as well as wider societal distrust in shared information when it becomes clear that the information was incorrect. Just think of, you know, the fake or the misinformation in terms of the Russian-Ukrainian war, in Africa, the current war in the Tigray region, and we can all think of many other examples. Now, the other risk that I want to highlight quickly is fairness. LMs can create and fuel discrimination that results in representational, allocation, material, and epistemic harm by amplifying and perpetuating identity prejudice and stereotypes underpinning structural social biases. So this is, for instance, harmful associations of specific traits of social identities, telling untruths to a certain gender, or a nurse being always female, and such weird kind of connotations. LMs amplifying social norms and categories can marginalize or totally exclude, secondly, those existing outside of these norms and categories. For instance, that people called Max are male, or that families always consist of a father, mother, and a child. And then in the third place, LMs performing poorly for some social groups, either because of harmful language included in the training set or because of some languages being overrepresented and others excluded from the training set, can lead to exclusion and real harm in the case of such models driving technology that affect excluded groups. If you're not part of the data set, you don't exist, basically. Taken together, these three potential sources of harm are very powerful drivers of potential increased division, exclusion, social and epistemic injustice, and ultimately political instability. And then a further harm is quickly just picking up on toxic language, which can incite hate or violence, cause offense or fuel bullying, which again leads to exclusion and social and political instability. So now, if we want to ask what can we do, there's a movement around data justice, which privileges an explicit concern with social justice. The Global Partnership on AI and the Alan Turing Institute has such a project going. And then there's the notion of data activism, which is about problematizing the mainstream connotations of big data and massive data collection. And the focus is on mobilizing data sets for social causes. So it's about making sense of data as a way of knowing the world and turning it into a point of intervention rather than a point of manipulation or perpetuation of stereotyping and exclusion. So this leads then to what is called data activist research, which is about actively facilitating change for the better in communities in which data-driven practices are applied. You're not allowed to use my data in your model if your model will not contribute to my good, to my overall good in my community. We have to consider and reconsider, maybe in the context of this workshop and against what I've said, what AI ethics is. The danger is real, the technology is powerful. How can abstract ethical values and principles from on high have an impact on the real world? Well, AI ethics is not abstract, it's not from on high, and it's not an after-the-fact tick box. It is a dynamic system of enabling values and principle, and this is very clearly pointed out in the UNESCO recommendation as well, which is meant to drive action that ensures equal justice and potential prosperity for everyone and to adapt to the advances of AI technology. So as such, it's present throughout the life cycle of AI technology. It's not a tag on. It's also not just in the design phase, important in the design phase. Value by design is incredibly important, but it should be throughout all the stages of the life cycle. And given that a global instrument is intended by definition to ensure not only that no one is left behind, that epistemic just context exists for debate, it should also combat data colonialism. And thus ethics must be the core driver of the identification and shaping of policy areas and actions suggested by such an instrument. And in that sense, ethics cannot be some abstract thing that hangs around somewhere above our heads. It is an active enabler of everything that we say. And it must be bottom up. There's no from on high. And there are many examples of this, approaches of this in the literature: virtue ethics, ethics as service, and then data activism and data activist research, as I've said already. Then the last question that we have to ask is, who are the AI ethicists? Who should be an AI ethicist? What is the character or the training or the background of an AI ethicist? And really, who are they? Successful AI ethics consists of a dynamic, adaptable system of bottom-up defined values and principles. But we have to ask, who decides what an ethical norm is, or an ethical concern is, sorry, what is an ethical concern? And this will differ from continent to continent. Data ownership is really important in Africa, not so important in the North, because it's kind of taken care of. It's important, but it's not a concern. So it's far more an issue in Africa, maybe, and in the global South. And therefore, members of those communities of every community should be part of defining what an ethical concern is. Who decides how it should be addressed and when it has been addressed? So in the face of difference and exclusion, the challenge AI ethics faces is to make clear to the tech world and governments and everybody else that firstly, AI ethicists should have inter and transdisciplinary training. AI ethics does not belong solely to the tech community. It's not just because you have technical tools to address transparency, fairness, and explainability that they get to decide on all these questions. But it also does not belong solely to, well, it doesn't belong at all to abstract philosophy, but it also doesn't belong only to philosophy. There should be a collaboration. And then AI and AI ethics debates do not belong only to certain countries. AI research belongs to all of humanity because it impacts all of humanities. And everyone with the technical expertise should contribute at the AI table, while everyone else should be actively empowered to join as full participants as soon as possible. AI ethics research belongs to all of humanity for the same reason. And it is imperative for a global instrument that every AI ethicist from every region and country should be an active partner in the conversation. So there is a long road ahead of us. We should maybe 5 suggestions, share best practice and help each other, and UNESCO is willing to do that. Apply the value of interconnectedness as the golden thread to weave together a global AI ethics. Embrace difference and apply culture as the needle, not the scissors. To calculate and differentiate and distill values in manners that include every person in ways that are lawful, ethical, and just, and epistemically just specifically. We have to openly act against data colonialism and any form of exclusion from AI and AI ethics discourses. And this should happen in non-negotiably open, epistemic, just, and transparent discourses. I thank you, and I'm sorry that I went so fast, but I so wanted to cover all of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma, for this very comprehensive introduction. You're perfectly in time. We have
that I'm elated. I'm so glad.
I think we have maybe 1 or 2 minutes for one question. And because we have a very full program, I would like to ask everyone else to post questions into the chat. And maybe, I'm not sure, actually, we haven't spoken. I hope that, Emma, you have some time to at least answer some of them. But now we have space for one question. Is there a compelling question, Samanu? Can you quickly say something, because I can't hear no one speaking right now. I see a hand. I see a hand.
Okay.
Yes.
You want me to test, is it?
No.
We have another participant with a
yeah. I see a hand.
Hello, my name is Dee.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm coming from Australia, and I'm just thank you so much for that very succinct presentation. But one of the things I'm sort of like wondering is, like, we have a global community here, and we're talking about ethics and AI ethics, but we can't even like resolve a war that's happening. And I'm just sort of like thinking, is it going to be ethics by consensus, or, you know, like what is going to be the eventual ethics? Because, you know, we're the ones that are building the ethics inside of the artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence is, I mean, at the moment, is code. That's what it is. We're the ones coding it. So, so it's down to us. So I guess that's my question.
Thank you. I think I want to distinguish quickly here about two things, and I'll try to speak to both. The first one is, so coding ethics into algorithms, that's, you know, falls into the domain of machine ethics, and that's one issue. And the question, there's a valid question, whose ethics it will be. There are huge discourses whether what kind of approach is the best one, hybrid, bottom up, top down. I personally don't think the right way is to code any kind of ethical system into our algorithms. We should teach them to reason at exemplars. Again, you can ask which exemplars, but there are different ways of focusing on moral reasoning and what is the best way to resolve moral dilemmas, not staid ethical systems, because there are many. Secondly, the second part has to do with implementing, designing, developing, deploying, and using these systems in ethical ways, which is what the recommendation is about. And in that sense, who will decide? Everybody should decide. Everybody should be at the table. And we have proven, of course, in a limited context, but believe me, it wasn't easy. We have proven that if you have the will, you can do it. Yes, we can't agree about a war. That can't stop us to have these conversations and to have the will to understand each other. We have to. We don't have a choice. We have to. We have the whole of human history and the whole quest of philosophy to decide what it means to be human and what is the right thing to do, that we have compressed. We have a few decades tops to get this right. And there are luckily a lot of people and a lot of communities and a lot of institutions that are willing to take the time. This is it's time consuming and it takes patience, but it can be done and it should be done.